over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So thanks everybody for tuning in. As I'm sure you all know, old parish churches are often covered in a huge variety of marks, which have been scratched or sometimes burned onto the surfaces. In this short lunchtime talk, I hope to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of the principal types of marks, and then dig down more deeply onto those which were used specifically for protection from evil. Can I have the first slide, please, George? There we go. So I've been researching this subject area for over 20 years, and last year my book, which you can see on the screen, Magical House Protection, The Archaeology of Counter Witchcraft, was published by Bergharm Books. It's currently available in an expensive library edition hardback or an ebook, and hopefully later this year it will be available in a paperback. On the slide, you should be able to see the details of my website, how to get in touch with me, and social medias. So if you wanted to sort of find out a bit more about the subject, or if you want to get in touch with me separately, you can do that using those links, or of course you can do that within the CCT. So for some context, we're talking about protection from evil. So it's important to realise that in the medieval era, it was quite normal to believe in magic and the supernatural. They were seen as being real forces, similar, as real as the elements. And pre-Reformation churches in particular actually reinforced some of this idea through imagery and the nature of the rituals inside. It was quite a supernatural kind of feel to some of the Latin rituals which used to happen in churches. And it's true that right up until the early 20th century, it was normal in many areas for large portions of the population to believe that witchcraft and magic were still real. My own work and that of an author called Thomas Waters, who wrote a book called Cursed Britain, and my friend Jason Semmons, who's done work on Cornwall, has shown that people had very strong witchcraft beliefs right up until the early 20th century. There's a huge amount of physical evidence recovered from the fabric of buildings that proves this. We have things that were found within walls, in roofs, under floors, and these objects were placed specifically to repel, decoy, or trap harmful supernatural forces. Often the focus of these protective measures was the hearth in the house, because obviously the hearth is always open to the sky. You can't shut it like your doors or your shutters. And so we have a lot of objects focused on hearths in houses. But we also get marks carved onto surfaces, whether they be plaster, lead, wood, or stone. And we get them not just in secular buildings, but we get them in churches, and we also get them in military buildings as well. My book has separate chapters about all the different sort of find categories. So there are chapters about witch bottles, dried cats, lovely, horse skulls, written charms, concealed shoes, and of course protection marks. So which marks are which? There are lots of different types of marks. George, could we go to the next slide, please? So one of the main types of marks that many of you will be familiar with from your work in churches is Mason's marks. This table is just a selection of some that have been found in Herefordshire. And the important thing with Mason's marks is that they tend to be quite evenly carved with a chisel. You tend to find repetitions of them in buildings as well. And they tend to be fairly uniform in their placement on the individual stones that you'll see them on. So where you find one, you normally find a couple of others, and they're normally fairly consistently placed on the stone. The idea with Mason's marks was that they're a way of identifying who'd done what work on which bits of stone, and so the master mason or the site supervisors could ensure that proper payment was given to the people that were working on the building. Although there is sort of some sort of debate about exactly how this mechanism for identifying builders was used, because some churches have much more Mason's marks than others, and so it seems like there is some variety in the practice of using Mason's marks. Confusingly, quite a few of the marks also appear as protection marks. Okay, but we know when they're different, because you can see that the tooling is slightly different, the placement is slightly different, and we'll come to more details about that in a moment. And there are also the next slide is about merchants' marks. So if we could see the next slide, please, George. So this is a selection of merchants' marks. So in the medieval period, merchants' marks would often devise their own little kind of logo using these marks for their business. And sometimes they would appear on a seal ring. Sometimes we get these marks appearing on funerary monuments, on tombs. And sometimes we get them just scratched onto the surface in churches. I've seen lots of these in cathedrals. And what you'll see is that these marks combine sometimes religious symbolism and also some of what we call these Marian marks, which again is religious symbolism, these M's and W's we get at the bottom of some of these marks. And it's like the merchants were attempting to bring some kind of holy protection within the symbol into their own business. And then by scratching the symbol on walls in, for example, a cathedral, you're hoping that your business will attract some of the divine protection present within the building into your business. But generally speaking, they're used for practical reasons, for labeling their property and for identifying their own business. The next slide should be carpenter's marks. So anyone who's used to looking at old timber frame buildings will be familiar with some of these. We get regional variation in these marks. So the top left one, the Roman numerals one, is the most commonly found one. And as you go north into sort of Shropshire and Cheshire, you get the ones with circles as well. But essentially these are assembly marks. When builders were laying out the frames for timber buildings or timber structures within churches, for example, they would often lay them out on the ground, and these marks were used so they knew which timbers to attach to which other timbers, essentially. And that's why when you go into old timber frame buildings, quite often you'll see these marks, but they'll be upside down or the wrong way around, or hidden in funny parts of the building. That's because obviously when they were laid out on the floor, it didn't really matter where they were. And when they're assembled and erected, they end up in funny places. And the next slide should show some just a little bit of the sort of other kinds of graffiti that we get in churches, medieval and later. I generally just call it historic graffiti, but we've got on the right hand side there a sort of engraving of a hobby horse. We find a lot of those in Hertfordshire, for example, but on that particular slide there's also some medieval text and a little portrait of somebody. And on the left we've got some ship graffiti. This is quite a commonly encountered thing in the southeast of England in particular, but you can get it anywhere. I saw some in Gloucestershire recently, actually, in a secular building. But this one on the left is really quite crude, quite poor. Some of them are incredibly detailed, galleons with multiple sails and rigging. And whenever you find graffiti in a church, if it depicts something or someone or a place or a person or an item like a boat, an object like a boat, the idea is that it's bringing some blessing into that sphere. So when you get boats, people are trying to essentially protect their boats. But you can get all kinds of things. I mean, some buildings we get musical notation. I think in Norwich Cathedral, there's a large section of musical notation on the wall. Right, so we'll come now to protection marks. So protection marks are marks that they afford protection in their own right. Okay, so these marks are to bring protection to a place. They're not looking for protection by being engraved in a church. And so I'm going to begin describing the principal types of protection mark. I'm going to use examples just from Worcestershire, and I'll be including some CCT churches, notably Worcester, Evesham, Churchill and Spetchley, but a couple of other just Worcester locations. I thought I'd just pick a relatively small part of the country just to show that even within this one little area, we've got every kind of protection mark is visible and findable. So this particular slide, this first one is, as you can see, from St Swithin's Church, and it's in the window aperture in the bell ringing chamber. So the tower at St Swithin's is 15th century, but it was remodeled and replastered in the 1730s, and so all the marks in the plaster there post-date obviously the remodeling. And this one actually does have, if you look at the circular figure there, just right above it, there is very faintly visible the date 1754. And so it's a nice dated bit of graffiti. It's not so easy to see on this slide, but above that we also have two of these overlapping VVs, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment. But the main focus of this image is the daisy wheel. Now the daisy wheel goes by various names. Some people call it a hex foil, some people call it a rosette. It's basically a geometric figure that you can draw with a compass quite easily. So you draw a circle and you put the point of the compass on the edge of the circle and draw another circle. Where they intersect, you then draw another circle and you go round and round and round the perimeter of the original circle, and you end up with a 6-petaled design. This particular daisy wheel actually has 2 other daisy wheels superimposed over it. So it's so I'm not sure what you'd call it. I'm not sure what you'd call it. It's got 18 petals instead of 6. It's not a hex foil. It's an 18-o foil. But yeah, it's essentially three hex foils sort of rotated over the top of each other. Now, this design is basically an ancient solar symbol. Now, it sounds a bit bizarre, but the earliest examples of this come from about 1800 BC in Egypt. And then we find examples of this throughout the classical world. We find it on bronze shields in ancient Greece. We find it on Roman belt buckles. We find it on sort of medieval pottery and crockery. We find it on chairs, on fences. We find it everywhere throughout the whole of Europe from ancient times right up to the present day. In Romania, they still use this symbol today on their fences and gateposts, and the use of it is actually encouraged by the government there as being a culturally unique phenomenon in Romania. And they acknowledge in Romania that it is an ancient solar symbol. When you look into the occurrence of this symbol in the early settlement of America by the Westerners, we find it on early gravestones, and we find it on Pennsylvania Dutch barns dating from the 17th century. In the USA, they regard it as an ancient solar symbol. In Germany, they regard it as an ancient solar symbol. And in this country, we seem to have kind of forgotten what its origins are, but we do find it in places where it's protecting entrances, so thresholds, and also we find it quite often on things like church coffers. Now, circles are also an ancient solar symbol. The circle is the most ancient symbol, of course, if you like, for the sun. And the idea is that where this symbol exists, the light of the sun is there, and it's stopping darkness from lurking in that area or coming into the building. Now, you've got to kind of think supernaturally here. Remember, the people that made these marks were thinking magically. They believed magic was real. And where they put these marks, they actually believed that there was some kind of invisible force radiating the light of the sun, kind of on the other side, helping keep sort of spiritual nasties away. Now, we find, as I said earlier, we find this throughout Europe, but we also get it in Russia, we get it in the Middle East, we get it in China, Japan, India. It's literally all over the world, this symbol. It's one of the oldest symbols that you'll find engraved on surfaces in the world. Can we have the next slide, please? So here's another example. This is in the tower at Pershore Abbey, which when I did my book launch, we discovered these during that day. I didn't know they were there. I knew lots of other marks in the Abbey, but I didn't know about these ones. You literally can't see them with the naked eye. You have to shine a light obliquely across the surface as that person is doing with their phone. And this is a top tip, really. If you want to find marks in your churches, you need to get some kind of nice inspection lamp or torch, and you've got to shine it obliquely along the surface of the stone. And if there are any engravings or marks on the stone, they'll cast a shadow and you'll be able to see them very easily. And there are many times when I've found marks that I literally cannot see with the naked eye just by randomly shining my torch along the surface of the stone. And that's exactly what happened in this case. I thought I knew loads about Pershore Abbey that day. I was giving people a guided tour, and someone else found these daisy wheels, which was a pleasant surprise, shall we say. The next slide, please. We also find it in furniture. So this is a really explicit example. It's only on one side. It's not symmetrical. There isn't another one on the other side. This is a corner cupboard that I own, which I bought from an antique shop in Malvern. But you find carpenters used to just put it onto things because they knew it was for protection. And so carpenters and builders would sometimes include these things in their work just to kind of help out or provide an insurance policy, if you like, for whoever was commissioning the furniture or the building. And the next slide, please. So this looks a bit vague, I know, but this is someone has attempted to draw loads of circles on the side of a coffer in Specially Church in Worcestershire. So this is essentially someone trying to protect this coffer using circles, and these are overlapping circles. And there are more on other panels of the same coffer. And we're going to be talking about Marian marks in a bit, and on the top of this coffer there are some of those as well. So someone has been applying protection marks to this coffer to try and protect it and the contents within it. And there's one more slide which isn't from Worcestershire on these marks. This was years and years ago. I was asked to be a consultant on one of those Nick Knowles house history TV programs, and there was this door and they wanted to know more about it. And it's a beautiful 17th century door, and you can see the daisy wheel has been used in a decorative design on the door. So this door has a decorative design that's designed to protect and keep supernatural things out of the building. I love this door. I would love to own it, but I can't. It's a shame. Okay, so next slide, please. So we're going to start talking about Marian marks and what we call Christograms. Okay, so Marian marks refer to the Virgin Mary, and Christograms are marks that invoke the power of Christ. So we have two of them crop up a lot. In particular, Marian marks do. I think this is partly because obviously Christ is the focus of worship and the focus of much of the kind of ornament and detail in churches already. So what we get, especially post-Reformation, is lots of Marian marks being added into buildings where obviously they've lost lady chapels. I think that's partly what's going on with these. So the idea is VV. Obviously, this is actually the archaic way of doing a W, but we find such a huge preponderance of them that that it couldn't possibly be just people marking their own initials. They couldn't. We would have virtually everybody called William or Wally or Wilhelmina or something in villages if literally it was just initials. And what we find is quite often these deliberately placed overlapping VVs, and sometimes the other way around, looking like an M. And we find them all over the place. These particular ones are from Churchill in Worcestershire. And this is on the lead lining of a font, and there are lots of them all around this font. And there are also lots of circles. So this is an invocation to the Virgin Mary. And obviously when you have it the other way around as an M, it's M for Maria. And in the modern Catholic world and modern Catholic symbolism, the overlapping M and V is actually the monogram for the Virgin Mary anyway. But we find it carved onto all sorts of surfaces. If we could see the next slide, please. And this is Prince Arthur's Chantry in Worcester Cathedral. If any of you know your monarchies, you'll know that Prince Arthur would have been King Arthur if he hadn't died an early death, and then his younger brother became King Henry VIII. So it's a chantry chapel, so a huge amount of money was endowed on Worcester Cathedral so that monks would say prayers for the safety of Prince Arthur in the afterlife. But despite that, it was still felt necessary to put some Marian marks on this little bit of stonework next to his tomb. Now, the interesting thing here is that we've got them as the M, not the VV, okay, so it's Maria. But what you should notice with this particular example is that the legs of the M, they taper outwards, like in a curve. And if you look at the palm of your hand, you'll see exactly that M in the palm of your hand, okay? And that's the M for Maria that's on your own hand. And we find it quite often copied onto stone and onto buildings. And sometimes we even find it within a hand symbol carved onto a door. And there are quite a few examples of that in Gloucestershire. So that's the Marian marks, but quite often we find it, hopefully some of you can find that on your hands and it wasn't just me. Yeah, okay. But yeah, we quite often find this Marian mark in conjunction with a Christogram, so in conjunction with Christ. In these particular cases so far, it's just been Maria, but on the next slide, you should be able to see that we have Christ as well. So the old symbol for Christ is the I, letter I with a cross through the middle, and that's Jesu. Okay, so that's an invocation to Christ, and there it is on the font in St. Lawrence's in Evesham. And if you look just on the other side of that inspection lamp, you can also see a W or a VV for the Virgin Mary on that side as well. So, so we've got Christ and the Virgin on this font. And on the next slide, you can see again, we've got it in St. Swithin's. We've got the VV for the Virgin Mary, and then underneath, we've got the cross I for Christ, and someone's even helpfully added a C afterwards for Jesus Christ, so we can know that it's for him. So you'll quite often find these two symbols in conjunction together, but not always. The next slide, we should be looking at mesh patterns. Okay, so mesh patterns, these are a bit more vague, and they crop up more often in secular buildings than religious ones. But this is in Pershore Abbey again. This is in a really narrow passage up in the tower, and someone's just drawn a really big grid. And we find these all over the place, and we regard them as mesh marks. And the idea is they're kind of symbolically warding off or providing a kind of net that might sort of prevent entry of dark energies into a place. One of the most famous examples recently was found by my friend James Wright in Knowle in Kent, which is a big National Trust property. And in the King's Chamber there, in a royal chamber in the tower, they found one of these right in front of the fireplace, but on a floorboard, on a floor joist, so it was hidden out of view. They found it when they were doing some restoration work, and it had been deliberately placed there as a kind of ward, preventing things from entering that room in particular. But again, you know, we're in an abbey that's supposed to be protected by God, and yet people are still, you know, adding these marks into the building. And there are other examples that I've come across at Tretower Court, which is an 18th century property in Shropshire, and there's an early house in Massachusetts that has an entire gable end up in the attic is covered in these mesh marks, and as I already mentioned, Knoll as well. The next slide, please. So we also get shoe and hand outlines cropping up a lot as graffito. Shoe outlines in particular, you'll find them, well, I'm sure Muriel's seen lots of these on lead roofs in particular, but you get them on stone benches as well. This is a little example from Breedon, again in Worcestershire, but in Canterbury Cathedral, for example, there are literally hundreds of these in the cloisters. And some people think that they're connected with pilgrimage, where when people get to the site, they're drawing their foot outline, their unique sort of shoe. My friend June Swan, who pioneered the study of concealed shoes, which is another story entirely, she calls these soul prints, like the print of your soul. And and essentially, what I think again is happening here, a bit like with merchants' marks when you find them carved in churches, that the person who's outlined their foot on the church, on the fabric of the church, is hoping that some of the holiness will come into their life and protect them from evil by doing this kind of thing. We sometimes get them with initials inside and dates as well. I think that happens more recently, that the much older ones tend not to have dates. The next slide, please. Okay, so here is a similar idea, but a hand outline. Again, this is in Pershore Abbey Tower. In this particular passage in the tower, there are actually 3 of these, and one of them has initials. And again, it is an actual outline of someone's hand. And I like that they've drawn fingernails on as well on this one. But yeah, sometimes again, like the ones I was telling you earlier about in Gloucestershire, they sometimes have that Marian M inside as well. Next slide, please. Anyone who's come to Worcester for a meeting knows about Clockwatcher's Cafe. It's the finest eatery in Worcester. I'm just kidding. But it's all right. It's all right. It's got some nice halloumi salad for lunch. It's very nice. But yeah, this is an old, what looks like it used to be a chimney lintel that's now not a chimney. There's not a chimney breast. There's not a chimney there anymore, a fireplace. But these burn marks, they crop up anywhere that you find timber, and they're very, very deep, and they're actually unnaturally deep. We've done, I'll say experimental archaeology has been done on these marks, and they do not happen this deeply by accident. They just don't. If a candle falls over and leans against a beam, it doesn't take long before it splutters out and it just leaves a sooty mark. Okay, but to actually get these deep burn marks, you have to burn, and then you have to scrape away the carbon layer and reburn, scrape away the carbon layer and reburn again. And it can take up to 20 minutes to make one of them. And if they were from sort of candles or tapers or rushlights, you'd find fixing holes associated with each of the marks, but we don't. This particular timber has a few holes in it, which probably are to do with something like that, but not all of the burn marks are from that. We also sometimes find quite angular ones, which seem to have been done with a red hot poker, and they're kind of pressed and repressed over and over again. And it seems like the idea with these is similar to the idea with the daisy wheels, the idea that they bring the light of the sun to a location. Here we're bringing light, and by burning away the surface and leaving a sort of ghost of a candle flame effectively. On the other side, there's a candle flame burning, protecting that place from having any darkness lurking in that area again. You've got to, again, think magically, think of the other side, the magical side, where these dark energies lurk. And essentially what we've got here is a sort of chandelier on this timber. There is one example from a house that's open to the public in South Wales called Llancayac Fawr, which is not far from Merthyr Tydfil. And in a little dormer room above the entrance to that building, there are over 100 of these marks on one beam, and that's in a tiny little room. And so you have to assume that that person was incredibly scared and did lots and lots of burn marks. So that concludes my whistle. Oh no, I should talk about pentagrams very quickly. I don't have a slide for this, unfortunately. I forgot to include it. But pentagrams also crop up quite a bit. They crop up as masons' marks, first of all, so be careful, because in the Bishop's Palace in Worcester, for example, in the medieval part, there are pentagrams everywhere, and in that particular case, they are definitely masons' marks. But you do find them occasionally just solitary on their own, like there's a house that I work on in Shropshire that has a pentagram above one of the doors, and it used to be a symbol for the 5 wounds of Christ, and also for strength and protection. So you sometimes find it on medieval shields, for example. So I'm hoping that that sort of concludes my lecture, but I'm hoping that from this, you've begun to understand the difference between the different kinds of marks. You know, you've got the mason's marks, the merchant's marks, the carpenter's marks, the medieval graffiti, and the protection marks. And also just that this is just a tiny little case study from Worcestershire. There are hundreds of these marks, thousands of these marks everywhere. Wherever you look, you'll start finding them. It's a really fun hobby. You just got to get yourself an inspection lamp and start shining it across some timbers. And if you want any more information, or if you find any examples that you want me to look at, please feel free to send them along. And also, if you're really interested in this whole idea of magical protection, I do run a conference every 2 years, which called Hidden Charms, which looks at this topic and has a range of speakers dealing with it. We should have had the third one on April the 18th, but obviously because of lockdown we didn't, so it's happening on the 21st of November instead. And I think the next slide shows oh, it's gone. But there was another slide with the listing of what's happening at that conference, but it doesn't matter. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thanks for listening.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, Brian, for that. I'm sure everyone has really learned quite a lot there. I know I certainly have. There have been some really interesting questions that have come through. First one I've just seen that's coming from Marian. Brian, do you have any protection marks that you've carved on your own house?
No. I'm a tenant. I think I'd get into a lot of trouble if I did that.
But would you?
Would I? Yes, I definitely would. I definitely would.
Brian, I don't know if you can see the chat feature there, but there's been some other questions that have come in here, especially and a couple of comments there about the soul prints that you said. I think that's Mariel's said this. I'm really interested in shoes, both the shoes deposited in walls, but also in shoes carved into our lead roofs. Someone said that your shoe was unique to you, to the shape of your foot, and therefore like your fingerprints. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree. Certainly shoes used to be worn and worn and worn because they were expensive artisan things, and so by the time you did discard your shoe, it possibly been modified and patched and repaired several times, and this is where the idea of Cinderella's shoe comes from. It was unique to her foot, and that's because shoes were unique to everybody's feet, and you wouldn't just cast them aside willy-nilly. And so when you find these odd shoes concealed in walls, which we often do, the idea is that its uniqueness is what makes the negative energy, the spell or the witch, plunge down to attack it instead of you. So it works as a decoy, and I think that sometimes when you find these marks scratched as well, that maybe they're performing that function as well. But I think when they're scratched onto church roofs or into churches, I think it's more about drawing some of the protective energy from the church into your life rather than being a decoy in the way that it would be used in your own house. Someone's saying, will you find these marks on normal houses, the shoes? In normal houses, if you're talking about, this is Tracy's question, if in normal houses, yeah, you find all of the kinds of marks that I've been talking about for sure. The ones with shoe outlines, not so often in a secular building, but certainly all of the other ones, yes. And someone's asking about E-marks for Queen Elizabeth I. Yeah, that's Mariel. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one, is the answer to that one. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer, but certainly interesting. We'll certainly follow it up if I see any. And models of ships found in churches. Yeah, that's quite possible, Peter, with the idea that the markings for the ships might be an extension of the kind of models. Yeah, I mean, I think people would bring the models of ships and the markings of ships into churches specifically to try and protect. I mean, sailors had a very perilous life, so there's an awful lot of superstition around sailing and boat voyages, and certainly down in the southeast in particular, there's a huge focus on ships. And Rianne's telling me there are some marks in Bristol. I would like to see them, Rianne. Take some photos with a torch for me. Anybody else got any questions? you got anything by email there, George, or are we?
I've not had anything coming by email, but Brian, would you be happy if anyone had any questions, comment them on Newsbetter and you'd answer them there?
Absolutely, yeah, it's fine.
Brilliant. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining us today. And again, thank you to you, Brian, for doing that. That was really interesting. We've got some more lectures lined up, so we'll be sending another Zoom link to everyone about next week's lecture and also the next one. Oh, I've just had I think we might have had another one. No, I'm just going to let Shana, because I think Shana might have a question that she wanted to ask.
Hello, sorry, it's not from me. There were some questions that you missed. I think there was one from Jake that I saw, and now I can't find it. It was about people being fined, I think, for, where is it? Can you see? Could parishioners be fined for leaving graffiti or protection marks inside the churches, or was it accepted practice?
It seems like it was tolerated. So certainly there's so much of it that it must have been tolerated to a degree. And we don't see examples of people being punished for it in church court records or anything like that. But certainly I haven't.
Oh, Peter's got his hand up.
Mm-hmm. I'll just quickly unmute you, Peter.
This phenomenon, I was in Sweden a couple of years ago, and there was this fascinating medieval church which still had lots of altars that you would expect in a medieval church, which have obviously been cleared away in the Reformation in this country. But there was this very interesting one column in the church building itself, and there were a whole host of symbols carved in by just ordinary folk into this one column in the building. And we had quite a long discussion about what that was. And the suggestion was that it wasn't a it might have been a protection symbol, but what they were doing, they were making the mark of their farm on the church building itself. So they were, the families themselves were, although illiterate, were marking the recognition of their family in this particular church building, which was quite a sort of fascinating other way around. Rather than making the symbol, they were making their symbol on the building, and I assume a similar sort of exchange of protection was expected as a result.
It sounds exactly the same. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear exactly where that is, or see a picture of it. That'd be brilliant.
I have got some photos somewhere. They're buried somewhere, but I'll see if I can find them for you.
I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, this lecture has been recorded, so I will be posting it onto Newsbetter for everyone to view on YouTube. Again, if you've got any suggestions for talks that you would like to hear, anything you particularly like to learn more about, maybe connects with churches, or stuff that isn't necessarily connects with churches that you'd like an opportunity to learn about and find out more do drop us an email at comms@thecct.org.uk, or just send me or Shana an email with any of your ideas. But thanks again for everyone for joining, and again, thank you so much to Brian.
Thank you very much.